Thank you for downloading this episode of the Physicians Gallery podcast. In this series, we explore the history of medicine from A to Z, taking you on a journey from autopsies to zoonosis. Our wide range of topics includes diseases and treatments, plants and chemicals, and myths and curiosities. Please support us and help us to reach new audiences by liking, following, or leaving a comment on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. We hope you enjoy the podcast. So welcome to the podcast as we explore the history of medicine from A to Z. My name is Daisy Cunynghame and I am the Heritage Manager at the Physicians Gallery.
And my name's Olivia Howarth and I'm a volunteer with the Physicians Gallery.
And today we've made it as far as L. So my first L is lying in. Now, that doesn't just mean having a lie-in. Lying in is a specific term with a specific meaning. So it is to do with childbirth, but it isn't all of childbirth. It is essentially the period before and the period after you give birth when you are lying in your bedroom or your bedchamber. So there are a lot of different lying in cultures, traditions and rituals that surround that process across history and all over the world. So there's different lying in cultures in China, South America. But really, I'm going to talk about Britain because if I try and cover everything, we'll be here all day. So when we talk about these lying in cultures, we are usually talking mostly about upper classes and the middle classes. Poorer people would only have a confinement, which is another word for it, beyond just a couple of days if there was something seriously medically wrong. So it would be based on a medical condition rather than just something which you always did. Whereas if you're upper class, lying in regardless of your health is what you do. So in Tudor England, so late 1400s to early 1600s, that's when you really get the most rituals around your lying in. So there were 3 stages to it. The first stage, the woman would remain lying in bed, the windows and curtains were closed, the room would be kept as dark as possible. Her genitals would be washed, but her bedding would not be changed. That was, for whatever reason, that was quite important. So she was kept somewhat clean, but after birth, her sheets were not changed, and only one single female nurse was able to attend her.
Wait, after birth? So they give birth
Yes.
in the bed and then the sheets aren't changed?
According to what I read, that is correct. That's a very appropriate noise. Thank you. The next stage, she was allowed to sit up and move around the room. So bearing in mind, stage 1, she's not even allowed to sit up. But stage 2, she's allowed to sit up and move around the room. Her sheets could then be changed, and multiple female friends and relatives could visit her, but still not men. And then the third stage, she could move around the house. She still couldn't go outside, but she could move around the house. And more visitors, including men, could now visit her. And she could do some sort of light tasks, although, of course, not menial tasks because of her status anyway. Important thing to note is that, at least according to what I've read, it was the mother who decided when she was ready to move from one stage to the other. So it wasn't a rigid amount of time, although obviously there are still conventions around it that she's following. And it wasn't decided by a doctor or a midwife, it was decided by the mother. But the first time leaving the house after she's completed these 3 stages was to go through a process called churching, which is also sometimes called purification. So she would veil herself. She would be accompanied by the women who had helped her in childbirth, which were typically known as the gossips. She would go to church, kneel in a specific childbed pew separate from everyone else. During the service, she had to thank God for her safe delivery, and if her child survived the safe delivery of her child, and then she would be welcomed back into the community, and there was often a party. And all of this is not an assumption that historians have made. There are etiquette books from the time that document these stages. And there is a specific one called the Royal Book, which is an etiquette guide for the royal court. So that's from the 15th century. But it talks about the rituals around a queen and her lying in. And of course, it's even more layers of ritual to that. So there's very specific cloth that is used to decorate the room. They would replace any drapes with specific birthing drapes. An altar would be set up in the room, and various relics, saints' relics, were acquired to be placed around the room. So there's even more layers of ritual around it.
It's a bit wild. Bring me my birthing drapes.
Well, bring me my birthing drapes, but also bring me my birthing finger of Jesus, whatever. You know, it's because they're acquiring all these relics from churches around the country who are, obviously it's a huge deal if the Queen is going to give birth. So they're sort of, well, we need to borrow your finger of St. John the Baptist.
I mean, not to make too much light of it, but it's significantly more impressive than Whale Song or whatever people like your favorite playlist that people request now. Like I would like some relics at the birth of my child, please.
It's real status, isn't it? If you were only a lady of the manor, you'd probably get a less good relic. You'd probably get his third cousin's finger instead. There's a real kudos to that. I feel like if Kim Kardashian, could get a finger of St. John the Baptist or something, whatever the 21st century equivalent would be.
I mean, and they could bring it back as a luxury item.
I mean, it's way above beyond designer handbags for sure. So Olivia, what's your L?
So, at the risk of developing a little bit of a reputation for myself, it is a slightly controversial L. So I've gone for lobotomy.
Bold choice.
Yeah, okay. We'll dive in. Lobotomy, the word comes from the Greek lobos and tome, which is like to cut, and lobe. It's also known as a frontal lobotomy, a leucotomy, or prefrontal leucotomy, and it's a surgical procedure where the nerve pathways in a lobe or lobes of the brain are severed from those in other areas. So it was previously used as a radical treatment for different mental illnesses, including schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, but I should emphasize it's now very widely discredited. So it's the popularity of lobotomies in the 20th century is sort of a bit of a crisis point in the treatment of mental illnesses, and an example of disregard for patient rights and a little bit of medical brutality. But I thought it was important to try and understand how it came about. The idea of a lobotomy has its roots in another process called trepanning, where a hole is drilled or scraped into a skull. Evidence of trepanation, it's also called, has been found in prehistoric human remains from Neolithic times, and it's perhaps the oldest surgical procedure for which there's archaeological evidence in sites across the world. The reason why there's prehistoric evidence of trepanning has been debated quite a lot. It was either motivated by magical or religious beliefs, or it was performed therapeutically to relieve symptoms of disease. Some research has shown that the holes appear at sites of fractures, so it might have been an attempt to relieve pressure in the skull due to injury. And that's sort of a pervading idea around attempts to get into a skull generally across the history of medicine has been relieving pressure on the brain.
I enjoy it when you do a physical demonstration. Like, pointing at her head at this point.
I mean, the microphone might even have picked up that I tapped on my head then. Yeah. So Hippocrates and Galen are our favourite chaps. They directed trepanning to be used as a treatment for head injuries, and in the Middle Ages, it was practiced as a cure for various ailments, including seizures and skull fractures. And just a weird fact that I found, Prince Philip William of Orange was trepanned 17 times.
That feels like an almost excessive amount, I would argue.
I feel like it is very excessive, but he lived till he was 63. So, yeah, I was going to say it didn't do him any harm, but we don't know. So, other than the general concept of trepanning, there's also quite a lot we've got to understand about the context of mental illness treatment in hospitals and the rise of Victorian asylums. So, the modern era of institutionalized provision of care for mentally ill patients began in the 19th century when there was a sort of state-led effort to help people with mental illnesses. Public mental asylums were established in Britain after the passing of the 1808 County Asylums Act, which meant that justices of the peace could weren't forced to, but could provide establishments for the care of pauper lunatics so they could be removed from workhouses and prisons. And the Lunacy Act of 1845 explicitly changed the status of mentally ill people to patients who required treatment. By the end of the 19th century, national systems of regulated asylums for mentally ill people had been established in most industrialized countries. At the turn of the previous century, Britain and France combined had had only a few hundred people in asylums, but by the end of the 19th century, that had risen to hundreds of thousands. So by the early 20th century, mental hospitals had increasing numbers of patients and little in the way of effective treatment. So few patients were returning to their old lives or were deemed cured in any way. And it's at that point that physicians and psychiatrists turned to radical and invasive experimental treatments, which are sometimes referred to as heroic therapies, usually with an emphasis on care and control rather than cure. This is quite a few different ones that I've got to tell you about in hopefully not too gruesome detail. So there's one called malarial therapy, which was used for people with general paresis of the insane. Malarial parasites were injected to cause a fever in the patient, which was then thought to cure the symptoms of the disease. Then 1920, there was the development of deep sleep therapy, where drugs were used to keep patients unconscious for periods of days and weeks. In 1933, there was insulin shock therapy, where patients were injected with large doses of insulin to produce comas. In 1934, chemical shock therapy, where patients were given a drug called cardiazol to induce chemical convulsions as a treatment for schizophrenia. And in 1938, electroconvulsive therapy, where a seizure is electrically induced. So as a context visual for the world in which lobotomies were discovered and deployed amongst as a treatment, that's the sort of world we're looking at, where those are common treatments being developed. It's a little bit stark and brutal.
I think the one that, I mean, obviously it's all very stark and brutal, but the bit that really stood out to me was general paralysis of the insane is basically late stage syphilis. The idea of treating syphilis with malaria, it's just like throwing different diseases at each other to think they counteract each other.
Yeah, it's truly wild. into this sort of brave new world of heroic therapies, you get psychosurgery, which is where lobotomy falls. So there was a professor at Yale University called John Fulton who he picked up on the fact, on observations that had been made during the First World War, that soldiers with brain damage to their frontal lobes were often left in a state of euphoria. They might be a bit giddy and childlike. He experimented on chimpanzees with a lobectomy to observe the effect of that, which is a lobectomy would be the removal of lobes of the brain. In 1935, there was a Portuguese neurologist called Agamoniz. I'm really sorry about my pronunciation there. He performed the first leucotomy on a human. His theory was that the mental illness was the result of fixed ideas that was supported by established neural pathways in the prefrontal lobe. And by disrupting those pathways, he could relieve the symptoms of the illness. And he thought it was an effective procedure to relieve anxiety, depression, and agitated states. At first, what he and his colleague Almeida Lima did was they injected alcohol into the prefrontal lobes, but then they modified their technique by using a tool to sever the neural links with a tool called a leucotome, which had a retractable wire loop that was inserted into the frontal lobe and rotated. Moniz was later awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1949 for the discovery of the therapeutic value of leucotomy in certain psychoses, which is now obviously quite contentious. There was an American surgeon called Walter Freeman who was an advocate of psychosurgery, and he took Moniz's procedure, renaming it lobotomy. He then went on to develop a cheaper, more effective technique, which he called the transorbital lobotomy, where a pick was inserted above the patient's eyeball through the orbital ridge to sever the connections to and from the prefrontal cortex. So the procedure was controversial from the outset and was resisted and criticized heavily by other medical professionals. But Freeman's work sort of courted the media, and it did find supporters, and lobotomies were performed on a wide scale during the 1940s. Freeman himself performed or supervised more than 3,500 lobotomies by the late 1960s, and even in the UK, at the peak of popularity for this procedure, there were more than 1,000 lobotomies being performed every year. And procedure that he developed, this transorbital lobotomy, he developed it because it allowed him to perform the procedure more quickly and efficiently and in an assembly line. So he would visit state mental hospitals where the resident psychiatrists would have already identified patients and have them prepared and ready for his arrival. On one visit to the West Virginia Lobotomy Project, he lobotomized 228 patients over 12 days.
There's definitely, I mean, obviously lobotomies in general, it's quite dark, but there's something about the idea of an assembly line that makes it so much. It's the, I suppose, making patients, stopping them being human beings and making them just sort of a number in a row that makes it dark.
Yeah. So despite the low expectation of improvement or cure for most patients, many psychiatrists and patients' families believed that the results of the lobotomy would make the patient more manageable and easier to care for, and it was a preferred alternative to staying or remaining in an institution. Despite that, from the mid-1950s, lobotomies rapidly fell out of favour, partly because of the poor results and partly because of the introduction of psychiatric drugs. Long-term studies of post-operative patients confirmed that the treatment was worse than the disease, basically, and lobotomies were discontinued in most countries by the 1960s.
started thinking, oh, I wish I'd picked something lighter for my final L, like limes or the history of limes. That would have been good, but that is not what I picked. I picked lead poisoning. So this is what we're doing. Sorry, everyone. Lead poisoning, historically known as plumbism and saturnism, particularly symptoms of lead poisoning include all sorts of things: abdominal pain, headaches, depression, infertility, blindness, and brain damage. So it can go from, one extreme of headaches to something very severe on the other end. Bear in mind about lead poisoning, will make sense as we get through it, but it is a type of poisoning where symptoms develop very slowly over weeks and months from a build-up of lead in the body. So it's obviously not like arsenic or, it's those sorts of poisons. It's this very slow build-up. And typically lead poisoning comes from contamination in air, in water, in food, or in just objects in the household. So lead poisoning has been a problem for a very long time. People have been regularly mining and using lead since at least 2000 BCE. So it's been part of culture and life for a very long time. And part of the reason lead is very useful is that it has, in comparison to other metals, a very low melting point, and it is very malleable. So it was much more useful than a lot of other metals. So it crops up everywhere. So from back in Roman times, medieval period, right up to 19th century, there are theories that lead poisoning had a real effect on the fertility, particularly of rulers and high status people. Lead for a very long time was a product that was used the most by people in higher status. So there's an argument that your great monarchs, your great rulers, sort of challenges around succession, not being able to have children, can be traced back to lead poisoning. Now, obviously, that's very much a theory. There isn't enough evidence to prove it, but that is an idea that is posited.
Is that because lead was a rare metal? So it was sort of reserved for more noble?
For quite a long time, and by the time you reach the 19th and the 20th century, that is no longer the case. But yes, it was relatively rare. You had to mine it. You had to have proper mines in order to get it. Pre-19th century, just the process of deep mining was so challenging that it wasn't for everyone. It wasn't something that was accessible for everyone. So yes, it was relatively rare. It wasn't rare to the extent of gold, but it still was relatively rare. One of the associations with lead poisoning is gout. So people often think of gout as being caused by just eating too much rich food. That is a factor, but lead was a very significant factor as well.
Were all the gentlemen drinking port out of lead cups? What was happening with that?
Well, exactly. I think it was a double whammy of, eating cake off lead-lined plate and drinking out of a lead glass. Then yes, absolutely, it was the double whammy of the indulgent food and the lead together. But it was particularly a problem in ancient Greece and in Rome. There was a syrup called sapa, which was sprinkled onto food in the same way that you might sprinkle sugar today or salt. And it was boiled down grape juice and lead. So lead was not incidental, it was an actual ingredient in this syrup. In a society before they have regular access to sugar for historical reasons, this was what they used. They were essentially sprinkling lead into their food and their drink.
Was there a purpose for that?
Well, apparently lead tastes somewhat sweet. It was a sweetener, but it also acted as a preservative. So they were very intentionally ingesting lead. I mean, they're also unintentionally ingesting lead because it was the material that a lot of water pipes were made of. And actually, the word for plumbing comes from the Latin word for lead. So lead is very much built into the plumbing. But yes, it's sort of lead is coming at them from all angles. It's their cups, it's their pipes. It's literally sprinkled into their food.
Did all the ancient Romans have lead poisoning? All the rich ones.
Well, there's arguments for it. Again, we don't have enough evidence to prove it. But one of the arguments is, as Rome becomes more civilized is the wrong word, but more consumerist or more indulgent or whatever you want to describe it as, that lead is more and more present. So there's even more lead in plates and walls and tables and everything around you. And there's an argument that the fall of the Roman Empire, the failings and the excesses that appear to have increased in Roman emperors were due to the mental damage caused by lead poisoning, because it does do some very extreme things to your brain. Again, I'm not suggesting that's been proven, but that's a theory. That yes, it was so common that it caused the fall of the Roman Empire. Is a theory. I do not have the data to back that up, but that is a theory. But yes, so as I say, it's particularly associated for a long time with the wealthy. It is found in many oil paintings, particularly the colours yellow and white would often have a lot of lead in them. It's used in face powder and mascara. It's used in cutlery and coins and roof tiles. It's the glazing on a lot of pottery. It's used in stained glass. It's used to colour wigs. If you have a white wig or a very pale wig, that was often involved lead. And in Japan as well, the geishas whitening their faces, that was often a lead-based paint or makeup.
Was Elizabeth I's famous white face, was that lead face paint?
Yes, it was. It wasn't the only ingredient, but lead was a significant part of that. But I suppose, of course, just to say, although for a long time it was associated with the wealthy, it wasn't exclusively so, because the people who were making all of these things were poor. So the people who were going down into the mines or who were making all of these products, who were smelting and processing the lead. And there was another one of these theories or these rumours, is that there was a lot of ideas around mines being possessed, there being ghosts and spirits in the mines, and one theory on that is that this is the hallucinations that were caused by lead poisoning were causing people to see these. It certainly seems that there were supposedly more ghosts seen in lead mines than in, say, coal mines, which might suggest that that's what was going on, that lead poisoning taking place. It also wasn't just an inadvertent poison, it was sometimes an intentional poison. So lead is particularly associated with the Medicis, who were a very prominent family in Renaissance Europe, and it being used intentionally to poison their enemies. And the advantage to using lead as a murder weapon, this is not the lead poisoning marketing board here, but the advantage to it was because it was invisible and it was slow acting, you were more likely to get away with it. So, if you poison somebody and they instantly die, people might figure out, where were you at the time of the poisoning? But if you can poison somebody and they only die from it weeks or months later, then you are sort of removed from implication. So it was used in that sense. It got to a point in France where lead was nicknamed succession powder. So it was the thing that you use to bring about your succession to the throne.
Surely, did someone not kind of cotton on to the fact that all the Medici's enemies were dying?
I think so. And they had a quite terrifying reputation because of that. But, what do you do about it?
Thank you for listening to this Physicians Gallery podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, click like, or leave a positive review or comment. We truly appreciate your support because it helps us reach more people. If you'd like to know more about the Physicians Gallery, our exhibitions and upcoming events, please check out our website and social media pages. Links are in the description for this episode. Thank you.